The knock never came. That was the part that shook Winifred Maddox to her very core when she opened the door and found him there, half buried in white, standing in the roaring mouth of the worst blizzard to hit Laramie County, Wyoming territory in 11 years. Jonas Easton did not knock. He did not call out her name. He did not ask permission. He simply stood on the threshold of her homestead cabin with snow packed into the creases of his duster coat, ice crystallized on the brim of his hat, and blood dark, thick, and unmistakable, staining the left side of his shirt. He looked at her the way a man looks at the only shelter left on the face of God's ruined earth. And then he said, in that low, deliberate voice that she had heard exactly 4 times in the 3 years she had lived 11 miles from his cattle operation, the 4 words that changed absolutely everything. "Move over. I am staying." Winifred stood frozen, the oil lamp in her hand throwing amber light against the absolute wall of white behind him. The wind screamed between them like something alive and furious. She had every reason in the world to slam that door. She had been carrying reasons to slam that door on Jonas Easton for a very long time. He had never said more than a handful of sentences to her across every encounter they had shared in this territory. He had watched her from across the general store in Redemption Flats with those dark, unreadable eyes and said nothing. He had ridden past her fence line on his black horse, tipped his hat once, and kept riding. He was a man of breathtaking silence and infuriating mystery, and she had told herself on more than one cold night alone that she did not care one single solitary bit about Jonas Easton or what he thought about anything. But his blood was real. The blizzard was real. And the look in his eyes, not pleading, not commanding, but something rawly and devastatingly honest that she could not name, was the most real thing Winifred Maddox had faced since the day she buried her husband. She moved over. He came inside. The door slammed shut behind him, and the roar of the storm was reduced to a howl, then a moan, pressing against the walls of her small home like something that wanted to devour them both. Winifred set her lamp on the table and turned to face him. He was already pulling off his coat, moving with a careful, controlled deliberateness that she recognized immediately as the movement of a man managing pain. His jaw was clenched. His breathing was measured. The blood had spread further than she had first realized, a dark bloom across his left side that made her stomach go cold. "You are bleeding," she said. It came out flat, factual. Like she was commenting on the weather. "I noticed," Jonas Easton said, and that was the beginning. 3 years earlier, Winifred Maddox had arrived in Wyoming territory on the Union Pacific Railroad with $42, a steamer trunk, a horse named Margaret that she had purchased in Cheyenne, and a deed to 160 acres of homestead land that her late husband, Clement Maddox, had filed for under the Homestead Act of 1873, 1 year before a rattlesnake in the root cellar of their Missouri farm ended his life with terrifying speed. Clement had been a dreamer, the kind of man who read land advertisements in the back of farm journals and circled possibilities in charcoal pencil. He had dreamed of Wyoming, of wide grass and clean air and cattle so fat they practically walked themselves to market. He had filed the claim and told Winifred about it over supper the same week he died, the paperwork still fresh with ink. She had been 26 years old. She had no family in Missouri that amounted to anything. And she had been left with a dream that was not entirely her own, but had somehow, in the grief and confusion of those first weeks after Clement's death, become the only thing she could hold on to. So she came west. She built the homestead with her own hands and the help of 2 hired men from town who charged her a fair wage and taught her more than they probably had to. She dug her own well. She planted a kitchen garden. She acquired 4 milk cows and 2 dozen chickens and a single hog she named Oliver, and she settled into the kind of stubborn, solitary competence that the frontier demanded of everyone who stayed on it long enough. She had heard about Jonas Easton before she ever saw him. In Redemption Flats, the man's name came up the way legends do, mentioned sideways, accompanied by lowered voices and a certain reverence that always made Winifred faintly suspicious. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county. He had come to Wyoming 8 years ago from somewhere nobody entirely agreed on. Some said Texas. Some said New Mexico. One old-timer at the feed store swore up and down that Jonas Easton had ridden with the Texas Rangers before some unnamed darkness in his past pushed him north and silent. He employed 15 cowboys at the height of summer and paid them better than any other outfit in the territory. His cattle were the best bred in 4 counties. He did not drink in excess. He did not cheat at cards. He did not cause trouble of any kind. He also did not talk, not in the way that most people understood talking. He communicated what was necessary. He made his meaning absolutely clear. But he did not fill the air with words the way most people did. And this, in a small frontier community where gossip and conversation were the primary social currencies, made him an object of endless fascination and not a small amount of unease. The first time Winifred saw him in person, she was at the general store owned by a man named Horace Finch, examining a bolt of wool fabric and calculating whether she could justify the expense. Jonas Easton had walked in, said to Horace, "Salt blocks, 40 pounds, 2 bags of oats," and then stood waiting by the counter with his hat in his hands. He was tall. He was lean in the particular way of men who worked hard and slept rough. He had dark hair gone slightly silver at the temples despite the fact that he could not have been much past his mid-30s, and he had the kind of face that landscape carves, strong and angular and weathered but not unkind. He had looked at her once briefly. She had looked back. Neither of them said anything. She bought the wool fabric. He loaded his salt blocks. They did not speak. This pattern repeated itself in various forms over the following 3 years. They existed in the same county, the same small constellation of human settlement, and managed to occupy it with a silence between them that Winifred could never quite decide whether to call comfortable or charged or simply inevitable. He was her nearest neighbor of any significance, 11 miles of rolling grassland separating his spread from hers. He had never visited. She had never invited him. The second time they exchanged actual words, she had been dealing with a crisis that had pushed her to the raw edge of desperation. It was the spring of 1876, and a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Doyle Prestwick had reached a point that threatened everything she had built. Prestwick was a man with a brutal simplicity of purpose. He wanted her land. Not because he needed it particularly. He had 3 times as many acres as he could reasonably manage, but because he was the kind of man who counted his worth in territory and viewed a woman running a homestead alone as an opportunity rather than a boundary. He had started small. A section of her fence pulled down, which she had assumed was weather. Then 3 of her milk cows had wandered through the gap and been quietly absorbed into Prestwick's herd, and when she rode over to retrieve them, Prestwick had smiled at her from his porch and told her that she was welcome to look, but that he had not seen any Maddox cattle on his range. The third incident had been more direct. 2 of Prestwick's men had ridden past her property line at night and burned a section of her outbuilding, a small shed where she stored winter feed. The fire had stopped short of spreading to the barn only because Winifred had been awake and had hauled water in a fever of terror and physical effort that left her shaking for 2 days. She had gone to the sheriff in Redemption Flats, a man named Augustus Webb who was not corrupt exactly, but who was comfortable, and comfort in a frontier town often looked a great deal like blindness when it came to the complaints of a lone woman against an established rancher with money and men. Webb had listened to her carefully and told her he would look into it, which she understood to mean that he would do precisely nothing. It was on the road back from that unsatisfying meeting with Sheriff Webb that she had encountered Jonas Easton. He was riding in the opposite direction, toward town, on his black horse, a magnificent animal named Phaeton, according to the gossip at the store. He had pulled up when he saw her expression, which even Winifred would have admitted was not her usual controlled blankness, She had been fighting tears the entire ride from Redemption Flats, furious at herself for it, and the fight had left traces all over her face. Jonas Easton had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Prestwick," she had blinked. "Excuse me." "The look on your face," he said. "It is a Prestwick look." Against everything she was feeling, something almost like a laugh moved through her. "He burned my feed shed." Jonas Easton had not said anything immediately. He looked at the horizon for several seconds in that way he had, as though he were reading something written on the sky. Then he said, "I know a lawyer in Cheyenne, name of Alderton. He has dealt with Prestwick before successfully. I will write you a letter of introduction if you want it." The offer was so direct, so practical, and so unexpectedly generous that Winifred had simply stared at him. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because Prestwick is a problem," Jonas Easton said simply. "And problems do not stop being problems until someone deals with them." He had written her the letter. She had gone to Cheyenne. Alderton had been formidable. Within 6 weeks, Prestwick had received a legal notice that made further interference with the Maddox homestead an extremely costly proposition. The intimidation had stopped. Her cows had never come back, and she had chalked that up to a battle she could not win, but the fear had lifted. She had not thanked Jonas Easton properly, she realized afterward. She had sent a note. He had not replied. But the next time she saw him at the store, he had looked at her with something brief and steady in his expression that she chose to interpret as acknowledgement, and she supposed that was what passed for warmth between people who moved through life in the particular way that both of them did. The third time they exchanged more than a glance was at the Redemption Flats Church social in the summer of 1876. Winifred had gone because the Reverend's wife, Edna Kessler, had spent 3 consecutive Sundays making it personally clear that Winifred's absence from community events was being noticed and unfavorably interpreted. And Winifred, while not especially susceptible to social pressure, had decided that a few hours of lemonade and pie was a more efficient solution than 3 more Sundays of Edna's meaningful looks. Jonas Easton had been there, which surprised her. She had not imagined him as the type to attend church socials. He had been standing at the edge of the gathering the way he always stood at the edge of everything, separate, watching, contained. She had found herself beside him almost by accident, both of them having drifted to the same section of fence to escape the density of the crowd. "I did not expect to find you here," she said. "Edna Kessler," he said by way of explanation. Winifred had laughed at that, genuinely, without reserve, and he had looked at her with something in his expression that shifted so quickly she almost missed it. But she did not miss it. She was a woman who had learned to read the subtle languages of silence, and what she saw in Jonas Easton's face in that moment was something that landed in her chest like a hand pressed flat against her heartbeat. She had looked away before she could examine it further. They had talked for perhaps 20 minutes. It was the longest consecutive conversation she had ever had with him. He asked about her cattle operation, which she had tentatively begun to expand. She asked about his breeding program, which he was clearly proud of in the restrained way he was proud of everything. They did not discuss anything personal. They discussed nothing of feelings or history or the particular weight of the lives they were each living alone. But she rode home that evening with a feeling she could not name sitting in her chest like an ember, warm and slightly alarming. She told herself to leave it alone. She was a widow with a homestead and a future that was entirely constructed of practical necessity. She did not have room in her careful, solitary architecture for something like what was beginning, in the most treacherous part of her interior, to feel like longing. She left it alone for the next year and a half. And then November 1877 arrived, and with it, a blizzard of historic proportions, and Jonas Easton bleeding on her threshold. Back in the cabin, the storm beating against every wall with a particular fury, Winifred built the fire higher while Jonas Easton sat at her kitchen table and let her look at the wound. He had removed his shirt without ceremony, and she had found herself managing her composure with more effort than she would have liked, not because of any impropriety, she told herself fiercely, but because the wound was worse than she had initially assessed. Something had cut him, a knife, clean and deep, along his left side between two ribs. What happened? She asked, pulling her medical tin from the shelf. She had a solid supply of carbolic acid, clean linen bandaging, a needle and thread, and laudanum, which she kept for true emergencies. She had learned field dressing from one of the hired men who had helped her build the cabin, a veteran of the late war who said that a woman alone on the frontier had no business not knowing how to close a wound. Jonas Easton was quiet for a moment, not the comfortable quiet he usually inhabited. This was a different kind, a held kind. I had a man working for me this season, he said finally. Name of Creed. I hired him in September. I should have asked more questions before I did. Winifred pressed a clean cloth soaked in carbolic against the wound and watched his jaw tighten. He did not flinch. She continued. And, she prompted, he had a connection to Doyle Presswick, Jonas said. I did not know that when I hired him. I found out this evening. He was going through my ledger books, looking for information about a water rights agreement I have with the county land office. The agreement covers the creek that runs along my northern boundary. If someone could challenge my rights to that water, my cattle operation would become substantially less viable. Winifred understood immediately. Water was survival in this territory. An operation the size of Jonas's depended on reliable water access. Without the creek, he would need to either truck water at enormous expense or reduce his herd by more than half. Either option would effectively ruin him. Presswick, she said flatly. Presswick, Jonas confirmed. He never gives up, she said. No, Jonas agreed. He does not. She threaded the needle by lamplight, her hands steady through practice and will. How did this happen, the wound? When I confronted Creed, he panicked. He had a knife, a pause. I handled the situation, meaning Creed is no longer employed by me and is currently in my bunkhouse locked in, weather permitting, for Sheriff Webb to collect in the morning. Another pause, shorter. I was riding to get the doctor from Redemption Flats when the storm accelerated beyond any reasonable navigation. Dr. Galvin lives 3 miles past town, Winifred said, beginning to close the wound with neat, careful stitches. That is 14 miles from here. In this storm, that is an impossible ride. I am aware. And I am 11 miles from your spread. Also aware. He said nothing for a moment, watching her hands work. You were closer. It was such an economical explanation. Such a Jonas Easton explanation. She was closer. Therefore he came. He did not dress it up. He did not apologize. He did not make it anything other than the simple geometry of survival that it was. And yet she was aware, with a sharpness that had nothing to do with the cold or the crisis, that something was happening in this room that had nothing to do with geometry. She tied off the last stitch and bandaged him properly, wrapping the linen tight and clean. Her hands lingered for 1/2 second longer than necessary at the final knot, and she pulled them back with a discipline that cost her something. You will need to stay until the storm breaks, she said, moving to the stove to heat water for coffee. I said as much when I arrived, Jonas pointed out. Yes, you said it rather dramatically. I said 4 words. You said them dramatically. She set the water on. The loft has a hay mattress. There are blankets in the chest under the stairs. It is not elegant. It is warm, he said. It is enough. She turned to look at him then and found him already looking at her. He was sitting at her kitchen table in his wounded, shirtless state, with the perfect, unsettling composure of a man who had long since made peace with whatever storms the world chose to send at him. His dark eyes were steady and direct, and there was something in them that was not the comfortable blankness of his usual public expression. It was something closer, something that paid attention. Winifred turned back to the stove. I will make food, she said. You have lost blood and need to keep warm. She made cornbread from her dry stores and heated a venison stew that she had made the previous day, and they ate together at the table in a silence that was different from any silence she had previously experienced in his company. This one had texture. It was not empty. It was the silence of two people very carefully not saying things that were pressing against the inside of their teeth. Outside, the blizzard mounted. Inside, the fire crackled and the oil lamp threw its amber light across the rough-hewn table, and the two people sitting at opposite ends of it, eating venison stew and pretending, with varying degrees of success, that this was an ordinary situation. "Your stitching is clean," Jonas said eventually. "Better than Doc Galvin's." "I have had practice," she said. "On myself mostly." Something moved through his expression. It was brief. "Living here alone?" "Yes." He looked at his bowl for a moment. "Has it ever seemed like too much?" The question surprised her. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, and she considered it honestly rather than deflecting, because there was something about the stripped-down honesty of the night, the storm, the blood, the lamplight, that made deflection feel both impossible and wrong. "Every spring," she said. "There is a specific week in early April when the mud is still deep and the cold has not broken and the winter stores are nearly gone and nothing is growing yet. That week, every year, it seems like too much." She met his eyes. "And then April passes and the grass comes and I have this land, which is mine, which I built with my own hands, and it does not seem like too much at all." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The creek froze over twice last winter and I lost 8 head to a sickness I could not identify, and my foreman of 6 years left for California." A pause. "That was my particular week." She understood that this was a significant offering. From a man who spoke as little as Jonas Easton, this kind of disclosure was not casual. It was deliberate. It was chosen. She felt the weight of it and held it carefully. "How did you come through it?" she asked. "By being unreasonably stubborn," he said. She almost smiled. "An effective strategy. It has not failed me yet." The storm screamed louder for a moment, the cabin walls shuddering, and they both looked toward the windows, covered in darkness and the battering of snow and wind. Then the moment passed and they were looking at each other again. "Thank you for opening the door," Jonas Easton said, quietly, directly, in that way of his that stripped everything down to its essential truth. "You were bleeding in a blizzard," she said. "That was not a certain guarantee," he said. "You had no reason to trust me." "You helped me with Presswick," she said. "That was a letter of introduction. That was not a reason to let a man you barely know into your home in the middle of the night." "And perhaps," Winifred said more slowly, "it was something else." He looked at her steadily, said nothing. "Go up to the loft," she said, standing and collecting the bowls. "You need sleep and your body needs to begin healing. The storm will last until morning at the earliest." He stood slowly, with that careful management of pain that was not dramatic but simply honest, and she handed him 2 blankets from the chest under the stairs. He took them without comment and climbed the ladder to the loft. She heard him settle. She heard his breathing slow, over the span of 20 minutes, into the deep rhythm of sleep. She sat by the fire for a long time, not sleeping, listening to the storm and the fire and the breathing of a man in her loft, and tried to understand what was happening inside her chest. She had loved Clement Maddox. She had loved him with the whole, uncomplicated heart of a 22-year-old woman who had not yet learned the grammar of loss. He had been kind and imaginative and full of plans, and his death had taken something from her that she had not entirely recovered. She had built her life here in Wyoming on practicality and competence, and the daily, physical satisfaction of work well done. She had not built it on feeling. She had been, for 3 years, a woman who did not particularly feel things she could not manage. The thing currently sitting in her chest as she listened to Jonas Easton breathing in her loft was not manageable. She went to bed eventually and lay in the dark listening to the blizzard, and did not sleep for a very long time. Morning came gray and thick. The storm reduced from its midnight fury to a persistent, heavy snowfall that showed no particular signs of stopping before evening. Winifred was up before first light, as always, habit being the most reliable armor she possessed. She built the fire up, started oatmeal and coffee, and was standing at the window watching the white world outside when she heard movement from the loft. Jonas Easton came down the ladder with careful deliberateness, still managing his left side. He had slept in his shirt, which she had retrieved for him after washing the blood from it as best she could the previous night. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been through something, and had arrived on the other side of it still standing. This seemed to be his characteristic state. "How is the wound?" she asked without turning from the window. "Sore," he said. "Not infected. You did good work." "Sit down. There is oatmeal." He sat. She served. They ate in the particular morning silence that was different from the evening silence, quieter and less charged, the kind of quiet that belonged to routines rather than revelations. "The storm is still going," she said. "You will not be able to ride today. I know. Your man Creed is locked in your bunkhouse. My other men will manage him until I return. Dawson, my foreman, is capable." She sat across from him with her own bowl. "Tell me about Prestwick's plan, the water rights." Jonas looked at her with something that might have been mild surprise. Not at the question, she thought, but at the direct, businesslike approach to it. As though he had not quite expected her to go immediately to the practical heart of things. "He wants to file a counterclaim on the water rights to the Sentinel Creek," he said. "My agreement with the land office is from 1871. It is solid, but Creed was apparently sent to find any inconsistencies in my documentation, anything that might give Prestwick legal grounds to challenge it." "Did Creed find anything?" "I do not know what he had time to look at before I found him." A pause. "I need to get back to my spread and go through those ledgers carefully. Then we should plan to get you back as soon as the storm allows," Winifred said. "If Creed managed to take any documentation with him, we need to know what and act on it quickly." She paused. "I can ride to Redemption Flats when the trail clears and send a telegraph to Alderton in Cheyenne." He handled the previous situation effectively. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then, in a careful way, he said, "Why would you do that?" She met his eyes. "Because Prestwick is a problem," she said. "And problems do not stop being problems until someone deals with them." She watched him recognize his own words, spoken back to him in her voice. Something happened in his face. Not a smile exactly, or not only a smile. Something more layered than that. Something that moved behind his eyes and settled into the lines around them. "You have a good memory," he said. "I remember things that matter," she said. They looked at each other across the table, and the fire popped, and outside the snow continued to fall, and Winifred Maddox felt, with absolute and terrifying clarity, that she was in serious trouble. The day stretched with the particular character that blizzard confinement creates. There was work to do even inside, and they both found it naturally. Jonas, despite his wound, was not a man who could sit idle, and she watched him mend a piece of leather harness he found hanging on a peg near the door, working it with the unconscious ease of a man whose hands had spent decades in purposeful labor. She worked at her own tasks, mending, accounting, the careful documentation of her winter stores that she did at the end of each month. They worked in the same room, in the same silence, and the silence was warm and easy in a way that nothing in Winifred Maddox's life had been warm and easy in a very long time. In the afternoon, while the storm continued its assault and the light through the windows went from gray to pewter, Jonas looked up from the harness and said, "Were you happy here before today?" "Generally." She considered the question seriously. "Generally," she said. "Yes, I built something real. I understand what I have and what it cost, and I am not careless with it." She looked at him. "Were you generally happy?" He was quiet for a moment. "I have been comfortable," he said. "There is a difference." This sat between them for a moment. "What would make you more than comfortable?" she asked. It was a bolder question than she usually permitted herself, and she felt the boldness of it as she said it, a slight heat in her face, but she held his gaze. He looked at her steadily. "I have a theory about that," he said. "I have not tested it yet." She held his gaze for 3 full seconds before looking back down at her accounts, but she was not seeing numbers. She was seeing the look in his eyes and hearing the careful weight he had put on the word "yet." By evening the storm had reduced itself to a heavy, steady snowfall, and the wind had dropped to something manageable. They both knew the road would be passable by tomorrow morning. They both knew this was the last night of this strange, forced intimacy that the blizzard had created, and neither of them spoke about it. but the knowledge of it was in the room like a physical presence. She made supper salt pork and dried beans and more cornbread, and they ate together again, and this time the conversation moved differently. It moved across ground it had never entered before. She told him about Clement, not as confession or grief, but as history, her own history that he deserved to understand if he was going to understand her at all. She told him about the journey west and the first terrible winter and the spring that followed it and the moment she had looked at what she had built and understood that it was genuinely, permanently hers. He listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering sympathy in the patronizing form that most people offered it, just listening with those dark, attentive eyes. Then he told her something in return. "I was engaged once," he said, "in Texas. Her name was Rosalind Bright. She was the daughter of a rancher I worked for." A pause. "Her father decided I was not adequate for her. He was not wrong at the time. I was 23 and had nothing. But the manner in which he made that decision clear, the manner in which he communicated it, involved a level of contempt for my origins that I found difficult to set aside." Another pause, shorter. "I came north after that. I decided I would build something that no one could dismiss." "And you did," Winifred said. "Yes," he said. "And then I found that the thing I had built was entirely solitary, and that solitary things, however well constructed, do not stay warm." The fire crackled. The snow fell quietly outside. "Jonas," she said, and his name in her mouth for the first time felt like a door opening. He looked at her. "How long have you been driving past my property line without stopping?" she asked. The look on his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, briefly, completely unguarded. "Longer than is reasonable," he said. "Why did you never stop?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the stripped-down honesty that was, she was beginning to understand the most fundamental thing about him, he said, "Because I was not certain I would be able to leave again." The fire, the snow, the lamp. Two people on the frontier in a cabin built by a woman's own hands, looking at each other across a table in the last night of a blizzard. Winifred stood up. She walked around the table. He stood up slowly, managing his left side, and faced her. They were close, closer than they had ever been before in 3 years of living 11 miles apart and existing in the same careful orbit. She could see the individual lines of his face, the weathering and the steadiness, and the thing behind his eyes that she had been reading and not naming for longer than she had admitted to herself. "You do not have to leave tomorrow," she said. "Not right away. Ride back to your spread, deal with Creed, go through your ledgers, and then come back." Something in his expression moved, deep and certain. "To tell you what I find in the ledgers," he said, and there was the faintest thing in his voice, something that in a different man she might have called teasing. "To stop driving past my fence line," she said. He reached up and with a deliberateness that was entirely characteristic and entirely devastating, took her right hand in both of his. He held it for a long moment, looking at it, and then looked up at her face. "That I can do," Jonas Easton said. He left the next morning, the road sufficiently clear for careful travel. She watched him ride out on his black horse, moving through the fresh white world with a slow, careful grace, managing his left side. He turned once, at the edge of her property line, and looked back at her. She was standing in the doorway. She raised one hand. He raised his briefly and then rode on. She stood there until he was gone from sight, and then she went back inside and sat down at her table and pressed both hands flat against the surface, feeling the solid reality of it, and breathed. He came back 4 days later, on a cold, clear morning that sparkled with ice crystals and low winter sun. He came on Phaeton, and he had with him a saddlebag full of papers, and his expression was grim in a way that told her the Ledger Review had not gone well. She brought him inside and gave him coffee, and he laid the papers on her table. "Creed got to more than I hoped," he said. "He has a copy of the original 1871 water rights agreement, and he also has a letter from the land office that could be read as an ambiguity in the boundaries of the creek easement. With the right lawyer, Prestwick could potentially turn that ambiguity into a challenge that would tie up my rights in the courts for 2 years. 2 years without clear water rights would be catastrophic for the operation. Winifred studied the papers. She had, in 3 years of homesteading, become more familiar with land law than she had ever anticipated. "Have you sent for Alderton?" "I have. He is coming from Cheyenne on Thursday." He paused. "I wanted your assessment first." She looked at him. "Why mine?" "Because you are the most practically intelligent person I know in this county," he said simply, "and because you have dealt with Prestwick before and understand how he operates." She looked at the papers for a long time, reading carefully. Then she said, "The ambiguity is in this line here. The easement is described as running along the eastern bank of Sentinel Creek to the junction with Rawlings Branch. The question is, which bank is the eastern bank when the creek curves? Because there is a significant curve at the relevant section. Prestwick's lawyer will argue that the eastern bank changes character at the curve, and that the relevant section of the easement applies to a different piece of land than the one Jonas Easton has been treating it as." "Yes," Jonas said. "That is exactly what Alderton told me when I described it to him over the telegraph." "The solution is to have the survey redone," Winifred said. "A current survey, conducted by a certified federal surveyor, that definitively maps the creek and establishes the bank boundaries. If the survey supports your use of the easement, which it will if the land has not significantly changed, it creates a new document that is superior to the ambiguous original." Jonas was looking at her steadily. "That is what Alderton said." "Then Alderton is good at his job," she said. "When does he arrive?" "Thursday." "I will come with you," she said. "I dealt with the previous Prestwick situation and Alderton knows my name. I may be useful." He did not argue. He did not tell her she need not trouble herself. He simply looked at her with that steady, attentive gaze and said, "I would be glad of that." They met Alderton at Jonas's ranch house on Thursday. He was a compact, energetic man in his 40s with wire-rimmed spectacles and a briefcase that looked like it had survived considerable adventure, and he greeted Winifred Maddox with genuine respect that told her Jonas had described her accurately. They spent the afternoon working through the documentation and building a strategy. Alderton would file for a federal survey immediately. Simultaneously, he would send a legal notice to Prestwick's attorney making it clear that any challenge to the water rights based on Creed's obtained documents would be met with a suit for illegal acquisition of private business records, because Creed had acted as a paid agent of Prestwick, which made Prestwick culpable for how those documents had been obtained. The strategy was sound. It would not be fast, but it would be effective. Sheriff Webb, it turned out, was somewhat more motivated to act when the victim was Jonas Easton rather than a lone woman homesteader, an injustice that was not lost on either Jonas or Winifred, and one that Jonas named plainly when Webb arrived to collect Creed. "Your office was less responsive when the same man's actions affected Mrs. Maddox," Jonas said to Webb in a tone that was perfectly even and entirely uncompromising. "I would like that inconsistency addressed." Webb had the grace to look uncomfortable, and Winifred had filed the moment away with a warm, quiet satisfaction. Over the following weeks, the legal machinery moved. Alderton navigated it with the efficiency of a man who had spent his career in the complicated land law of the frontier territories, and Winifred watched the process with the attentiveness she brought to everything that mattered. What was also moving, with less formality but perhaps more significance, was the space between Winifred Maddox and Jonas Easton. He came to her property on Sundays. Not every Sunday. He was a man with a significant operation to run, and Sundays were not truly different from other days in the schedule of a cattle rancher, but most Sundays he came. He did not announce his visits. He simply arrived, and she always knew he was coming somehow. Some combination of Phaeton's particular sound on the frozen ground and a certain attentiveness she had developed that she did not examine too closely. He would arrive and they would work together on whatever needed doing, because there was always something that needed doing, and then they would have supper, and then he would ride back. It was deeply unromantic in its form. It was deeply romantic in its reality. He fixed her barn roof in January, working alongside her in the cold with a thoroughness and precision that she recognized as the same care he brought to everything. She helped him with a calving crisis one February morning when two of his hands were down with sickness, and he needed an extra set of competent hands, and she provided them without drama and without requiring credit, and she could see that this mattered to him enormously, the absence of drama, the simple presence of competence and willingness. One evening in February, with a cold, clear moon making the snow outside her window look like hammered silver, she asked him about his dark past, the one that the gossips in Redemption Flats had always speculated about. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It is not as dramatic as people suppose. After Rosalind Bright, I was angry for several years. I rode for various outfits across Texas and New Mexico, and I was not, during that period, the most careful man about the company I kept or the situations I allowed myself into." He paused. "I was never dishonest. I never broke the law in any material way. But I made choices out of anger and pride that I would not make today, and I watched men I rode beside make far worse choices, and I was close enough to that darkness to understand it from the inside." Another pause. "That is what the gossips are sensing, the residue of proximity. I left it behind when I came to Wyoming. I have been building forward from it ever since." "Have you left it behind entirely?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "Mostly," he said. "There are some mornings where the anger is still there. Prestwick makes it worse because what he does to people like you, a woman alone trying to hold on to what she built, it is not unlike what Rosalind's father did to me, and it sets something off that I have to actively manage." He held her gaze. "I manage it." "I know you do," she said. "I can see you managing it. That is not a weakness." Something in his expression softened in a way she was just beginning to see and had come to treasure immensely. "Most people interpret silence as either coldness or secrets," he said. "You interpret it as management. You are a manageable man," she said, and then heard how that sounded and felt her face go warm. His expression did that thing again, that thing that was more than amusement and less than a smile, that private movement of expression that she was beginning to understand was his equivalent of laughing. "Thank you," he said gravely. "I will take that as a significant compliment." She threw a dish towel at him, which he caught, and he looked at it in his hands with evident surprise, as though projectile affection was not in his emotional vocabulary, and she laughed at his expression until her ribs ached. It was, she thought afterward, the most joyful evening she had spent in years. In March, the federal survey was completed. It supported Jonas's use of the easement entirely. The ambiguity was definitively resolved in the new documentation. Alderton sent the completed survey to Prestwick's attorney along with the notice about Creed's illegal acquisition, and received, after a period of hostile silence, a formal withdrawal of any planned challenge to Jonas Easton's water rights. Prestwick was not finished, they both knew. Men like Prestwick were not finished until something fundamental changed in their circumstances. But this particular battle was won, and it was won cleanly, and Alderton had created a legal record that would make the next attempt significantly more costly. Jonas rode to her property the evening the letter came with the news. He arrived at dusk, and she saw him coming across the snow-patched spring grassland from her window, and she went outside to meet him without bothering to get her coat, which she only noticed when the cold air hit her and she laughed at herself. He swung down from Phaeton and stood in the early evening light with something in his face that was relief and satisfaction and something else, something larger. "It is done," he said. "I know," she said. "Alderton sent me a copy as well." He looked at her standing there coatless in the March cold, and something broke open in his expression finally after months of careful management. "Winifred," he said, just her name, but in his voice, in the way he said it, she heard everything. "Come inside," she said, "before I freeze to death." He came inside. He did not leave until morning. That is to say, He slept in the loft again, and that was completely proper, and she lay awake below in her own bed for a long time, not in anxiety this time but in a kind of luminous, almost frightening happiness. April came, and with it the particular week she had described to him, the mud and the exhaustion and the depleted stores and the cold that would not quite break. But this April, the week was different. Not because the mud was less deep or the cold had softened, but because on the fourth day of that particular week, Jonas Easton arrived with a wagon loaded with lumber in two of his hands and spent 2 days building her an additional room onto her cabin, a proper sitting room with a real window that would face south and catch the afternoon sun. He had not asked permission. He had not announced it. He had simply arrived with lumber in hands and a plan, and she had stood in her doorway and watched him move around her property with that quiet, purposeful energy that she associated entirely with him, and felt something that she finally permitted herself to name. On the second day, while his men were finishing the window frame, she had found a moment when they were briefly alone around the corner of the cabin, and she had said, "You did not ask." "You would have said it was not necessary," he said without pausing in his work. "It is absolutely necessary." "Then yes," he said, "it was necessary, Jonas." He stopped working and looked at her. "I am not in need of saving," she said. "I want that to be absolutely clear between us." "I know," he said. "This is not saving. This is adding a room." "I mean in the larger sense," she said carefully. "I have built what I have here because I am capable and determined, and I do not require rescue. If there is something between us, and I think we have both admitted that there is, it has to be between equals." He set down the wood he was holding and faced her fully, giving her his complete attention. In that way that was itself a form of intensity. "Winifred," he said, "the reason I drive past your fence line on the road back from Redemption Flats is not because I am planning a rescue. It is because watching your spread, seeing what you have built out here by your own hands, watching the way you operate, I am, to be honest, somewhat in awe of you." He held her gaze. "You are the most capable person in this county. I do not mean for a woman, I mean generally." She stared at him. "I am adding a room because you need more light, and you have needed more light for 3 winters, and you will never take a day away from the work to build it yourself because you do not stop long enough," he said. "It is not rescue, it is noticing." She pressed her lips together to manage her expression. "You are an infuriating man," she said. "So I have been told," he said, and picked up his wood again. The room was finished by evening of the second day. His men rode back to his spread. He stayed. She made supper, and they sat in the new room together in the last of the spring evening light coming through the new south-facing window, and neither of them talked for a long time, and it was the best kind of silence, full and warm and without a single hidden motive. "Jonas," she said. "Winifred," he said. "Stop driving past the fence line," she said. "Come through the gate." He turned to look at her in the golden light. "I would like that very much," he said. He proposed to her in May, in a manner that was entirely consistent with who he was. He did not dress it up. He did not make a production of it. They were mending fence on the eastern boundary of her property on a clear spring morning, with the grass coming in properly at last, working side by side with the easy, practiced rhythm they had developed over months of shared labor. And he said, without preamble, looking at the fence post he was setting, "I think we should get married." She set down her hammer, looked at him, he looked at her. "I have been thinking about it for some time," he said. "I believe it is the right decision for both of us, for reasons that are practical and also, significantly, for reasons that are not practical at all." "What are the impractical reasons?" she asked. He set down his own tool and gave her his full attention. "The impractical reasons," he said, "are that I have thought about you every single day for 3 years. The impractical reasons are that the best parts of every week are the parts that contain you. The impractical reasons are that, when I am with you, I am more myself than I am at any other time, and that when I am not with you, I am aware of it as a specific and particular absence." He held her gaze without flinching. "Those are the impractical reasons. Winifred Maddox stood in her spring grassland with the Wyoming sky enormous and blue above her and felt something in her chest that was not grief or longing or the careful management of feeling. It was something whole and clear and certain. "Yes," she said, "those are good reasons." "Is that a yes to the proposal?" "Jonas," she said, and stepped close to him and looked up at his face. "Of course that is a yes." He kissed her for the first time, there in the spring field by the fence line, and it was not tentative. It was as direct and honest and fully present as everything else about him, and she kissed him back with 3 years of carefully managed feeling pouring into it. And the Wyoming sky stayed enormous and blue above them, and the grass moved in the spring wind, and it was the best fence-mending morning of Winifred Maddox's life. They were married in June 1878 by Reverend Kessler in the Redemption Flats Church, in a ceremony that was small and practical, and exactly what both of them wanted. Edna Kessler cried throughout, which Winifred found oddly touching. The guests were modest in number but genuine in feeling. A few of Jonas's hands and their wives, Horace Finch from the general store, Alderton who had made the trip from Cheyenne and seemed genuinely pleased at the development, and several of Winifred's neighbors who had watched her operate alone for 3 years and were visibly glad to see her happy. She wore the dress made from the wool fabric she had been examining in Finch's store on the first day she had ever seen Jonas Easton across a counter, which she had not mentioned to him, but which she was privately aware of as a small, complete story. After the ceremony, riding back to what was now their shared life, Jonas said, "Are you keeping the Maddox homestead?" "Yes," she said, "it is mine. Clement built it in his imagination and I built it in reality, and it is as much mine as anything I have ever owned. I would like to keep it." "Of course," he said. "We will manage both properties. The operations are complementary. Your cattle and mine can share the northern pasture. And I will not give up management of the Maddox homestead to you or anyone else," she said. "I would not suggest it," he said. "You are better at running it than any manager I could hire." She looked at him to check if he was making a point and found him perfectly serious. "You are a very practical man," she said. "I am a very sensible man," he corrected. "Practicality and sense are not the same thing. Practicality would have told me to hire a manager for the North Pasture. Sense told me to marry the woman who was already running it better than anyone else could." She laughed. He did not quite smile, but his expression was as close to radiant as she had come to understand his version of radiance to be. They settled into a life together that was built on the same foundation as the courtship that had preceded it: work, honesty, shared silence, and a mutual respect that ran so deep it had become structural. His ranch was the operational center of the combined enterprise, with its better facilities and larger workforce, but the Maddox homestead remained Winifred's domain, and she managed it with the same competence and authority she had always brought to it, now with the added resource of Jonas's help when she needed it, and never when she did not. They discovered, in the intimacy of shared life, the small continuous revelations that early marriage produces. She discovered that he read voraciously, which she had not suspected, that he had a small collection of books he had been carrying from place to place for 15 years, including a battered copy of Dickens and a surveying manual, and, inexplicably, a French dictionary. He discovered that she had a gift for drawing that she had never mentioned and never particularly cultivated, a series of careful pencil sketches in the back of her accounting ledger that mapped the features of her land across the changing seasons. He had come across them without warning one evening, and stood over the ledger for a long time without saying anything, and then looked at her with an expression she could not read. "Why have you never shown anyone these?" he asked. "They are for me," she said. "They are how I think about the land." He looked at them again. "They are extraordinary," he said. "You see things in this country that most people ride straight past." "I am not a natural rider," she said dryly. "I tend to go slowly." He laughed. It was his real laugh, not the almost laugh she had catalogued carefully during their courtship, but the full, actual laugh that she had only begun to hear since they married, a sound she thought she might easily spend the rest of her life working to produce. Prestwick made his anticipated next move in the fall of 1878. He had been quiet long enough for a careful man to assume he had redirected his ambitions, but Winifred and Jonas were not naive, and Alderton had advised them to keep their documentation in order. When Prestwick's new attempt came, it was through a different angle, an attempt to bribe a county commissioner to redraw the boundary lines between the southern sections of the eastern spread and the land office map. It was more sophisticated than his previous maneuvers, and involved a hidden motive that went beyond simple land acquisition. Prestwick, they discovered through Alderton's careful investigation, was in significant debt to a banking interest in Denver that had been pressuring him for several years. He needed additional assets to leverage against the debt, and the water-rich sections of the eastern operation were the most valuable land in the county. This context changed the nature of the fight. A desperate man was a more dangerous man than a merely greedy one. Jonas dealt with it with characteristic efficiency and without unnecessary drama. He and Winifred made the trip to Cheyenne together with Alderton and presented a complete, preemptive case to the federal land office that included not only their documentation, but evidence of the bribery attempt against the commissioner. The land office took a very dim view of the bribery. The commissioner was investigated. Prestwick's attempt collapsed under the weight of official scrutiny that he had not anticipated. The Denver banking interest, Alderton discovered, accepted a payment arrangement from Prestwick that resolved the debt question, which meant that Prestwick's specific motivation for targeting the eastern land was effectively removed. He would always be a difficult neighbor. The character that made him one was too deeply embedded to change. But the specific campaign of aggression against their operations came to an end. Winifred had stood outside the federal land office in Cheyenne on a cold October afternoon after the final meeting, watching the street traffic of the territorial capital move past, and felt a specific and complete relief. Jonas came out behind her and stood beside her. "Is it over?" she asked. "This chapter of it," he said. "Prestwick will find some other way to be unpleasant, but the organized campaign against our land is over, yes." "Our land," she said. He looked at her. "I like how that sounds," she said. "So do I," he said. She took his arm as they walked to the hotel, which she did not do habitually. She was not naturally given to public demonstrations of affection, but she did it then, and he covered her hand with his in the way he did that was quiet and complete and entirely his own. They spent the night in Cheyenne and had a proper dinner in the hotel dining room, which felt absurdly extravagant after the simplicity of their daily life, and talked for 3 hours over the meal about plans. Not crisis management. Plans. The expansion of the breeding program. A new barn they wanted to build in the spring. A possible purchase of 20 additional acres to the north that would consolidate the gap between the Maddox homestead and the eastern spread. It was the most ordinary, extraordinary evening. Spring of 1879 came with a warmth and abundance that felt like the land rewarding them for the previous difficult years. The cattle operation flourished. The Maddox homestead garden produced more than Winifred had ever achieved in her previous 3 years, partly because Jonas had quietly expanded the garden bed in the fall while she was occupied elsewhere, which she had discovered in the spring, and found she could not even pretend to be annoyed about. The new barn went up in April. The northern 20 acres were purchased in May. In June, Winifred told Jonas that she was expecting their first child. He received this news with a stillness that she recognized immediately as the deepest form of his feeling, the way he went entirely quiet when something reached the core of him. He stood in the kitchen of the ranch house in the early morning, holding a coffee cup, and looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling perfectly fine," she said. "I intend to continue working through the summer." "Of course," he said, and then more quietly, "a child." "Yes," she said, In the winter, Dr. Galvin estimates. He set down the coffee cup and crossed the kitchen to where she stood and put both hands on the sides of her face, which was so uncharacteristically demonstrative that she felt her eyes sting entirely against her will. "Winifred," he said, in that way he had just her name carrying the weight of everything. "Do not make me cry before breakfast," she said. He kissed her forehead. "After breakfast," he agreed. He did not make her cry after breakfast either, because he was Jonas Easton, and he expressed the magnitude of his feelings in ways that were not tears, ways that were instead a new gentleness in how he moved around her, a quiet attention to her comfort that she pretended not to notice, because she knew it would embarrass them both if she named it directly. He built a proper rocking chair for the sitting room with the south-facing window. He rode to Cheyenne and came back with a package of books that included a medical reference for pregnancy and childbirth that he placed on the kitchen shelf without comment. She read the entire medical reference and felt more prepared than she had expected to. Their son was born on a January morning in 1880, attended by Dr. Galvin and a formidably competent midwife named Hazel Drummond, who had delivered more babies in Laramie County than she could accurately count. Jonas was present throughout in the way she had expected him to be, close and quiet and entirely steady. And when Dr. Galvin put the baby in his arms, the expression on Jonas Easton's face was the most open and unmanaged thing Winifred had ever seen from him. It was not complicated. It was simply love, clean and complete, and without any of the careful management he applied to everything else. "He looks like you," Jonas said, looking from the baby to Winifred. "He looks like a newborn," she said from the bed, exhausted and luminous. "They all look the same at this point." "He has your forehead," Jonas said. "That is quite specific for a man who has seen approximately 2 newborns in his life." "3 now," he said. He sat beside her with the baby in his arms, and she looked at the two of them in the pale January light, and thought about the night she had opened a door into a blizzard, and found a man bleeding on her threshold, and made a decision that had led, through all the complicated, terrifying, wonderful geography of the months between, to this exact morning. They named him Thomas Clement Easton, Clement for the man who had dreamed of Wyoming, who had sent her west, who had built this life in his imagination so that she could build it in reality. Jonas agreed to this without hesitation, and she loved him for it. Thomas was, from the first days, a determined and opinionated person, which Winifred found appropriate. He grew into his first year with a sturdy intensity that his father watched with evident satisfaction, and his mother watched with the private, half-alarmed recognition of a woman looking at a version of herself in miniature. He was not quiet like Jonas. He was not especially quiet at all. He had opinions about his food, and opinions about his sleep schedule, and opinions about the general organization of the household that he expressed with a vigor and persistence that caused more than one of Jonas's cowboys to listen, wide-eyed, to the sound of a 1-year-old making his position known from inside the ranch house. "He has your stubbornness," Jonas said one evening, with the particular satisfaction of a man correctly identifying the source of something. "He has your tendency to make unilateral decisions," she returned. "Move over, I am staying," Jonas said, entirely straight-faced. She threw a dish towel at him. He caught it. Again, he always caught it. They built more. They expanded more. The combined operation of the Easton Ranch and the Maddox homestead became, over the years of the early 1880s, one of the most productive enterprises in Laramie County, not because they were ruthless or because they took advantage of others, but because they were both, fundamentally, people who worked with the same quality of attention and honesty that they brought to everything else. Winifred continued to manage the Maddox homestead as her own domain, with the same personal authority she had always exercised over it. She hired a woman named Clara Birch as a helper in the house, a widow who had arrived in Redemption Flats from Kansas with very little money and a great deal of capability, and the two of them developed a working friendship that was one of the most sustaining relationships Winifred had known on the frontier. Clara had opinions and a dry wit, and no particular reverence for either Jonas Easton's reputation or his silences, which Winifred found tremendously refreshing. "Your husband is standing in the yard looking at the sky again," Clara reported one morning in the fall of 1881, coming in from hanging laundry. "He is checking the weather," Winifred said. "He could look at a barometer," Clara said. "He does not trust barometers. He trusts the sky. He trusts himself reading the sky," Winifred said. "There is a difference." Clara considered this. "I suppose that is consistent," she said. In the fall of 1881, their second child, a daughter, arrived. She was born in September, smaller than Thomas had been, but with a ferocity of personality that became apparent within her first 24 hours and never subsequently softened. They named her Louisa Grace Easton, and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's precise and implacable way of looking at the world. And from the time she could walk, she followed Jonas around the property with an attachment that he bore with a tenderness he applied to very few other things. Thomas, at 18 months, was initially skeptical of the newcomer, but adapted with a pragmatic flexibility that Winifred privately thought was his best characteristic: the ability to adjust his worldview to accommodate new information without drama. Jonas watched his daughter with an expression that Winifred had begun to associate specifically with Louisa, a particular quality of helpless love that he had never quite managed to keep behind his customary management when it came to her. He was not less devoted to Thomas. She knew that with certainty, but Louisa had found a way into some part of him that existed specifically for her. "You are completely undone by her," Winifred said one evening, watching him carry Louisa on his arm while simultaneously trying to read a correspondence letter. "She is 4 months old and already has opinions about who holds her," he said, not denying anything. "It is remarkable." "She gets it from me," Winifred said. "Indisputably," he agreed. The Wyoming Territory in 1882 was a place of ongoing change. The railroad had transformed the economy. Cattle drives were being replaced by rail shipments. New settlers continued to arrive. The open range system that had characterized the earlier years of the cattle industry was giving way under pressure of fencing laws and land ownership. It was a transitional moment for everyone who had built their operations on the assumptions of the previous decade. Jonas navigated the changes with a strategic clarity that she had come to expect from him. He embraced the rail shipping model early, which gave them a significant advantage when the shift accelerated. He worked with the fencing laws rather than against them, which put him in better standing with the newer settlers and the federal administration than many of the larger, older ranches. He was not universally liked. He had never been that, but he was consistently respected, and in the long run he had found that respect was a more reliable currency. Prestwick finally sold his operation in 1883 to a land company from Chicago. He left the territory entirely. Winifred heard the news from Clara, who had heard it from Horace Finch, and she sat with it for a moment in her kitchen with her coffee, feeling something that she decided was not triumph exactly but was a complete and satisfying sense of resolution. She told Jonas that evening. "I heard," he said. "How did you hear before I did?" she asked. "Webb told me. He came out on other business and mentioned it." "Are you relieved?" He considered this honestly, in the way he considered everything. "Yes," he said, "not because I feared him particularly, but because the energy of watching for his next move can now be redirected." "What will you redirect it to?" He looked at her across the supper table with Thomas eating beside him and Louisa in her high chair and the south-facing sitting room full of evening light beyond the kitchen doorway. "To this," he said simply, "to the work that matters." She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned it over and held hers, and that was that. The ranch continued to grow. Thomas grew with it, from the opinionated infant to an opinionated boy who was, by his 7th year, following his father around the property with a seriousness of purpose that made even the cowboys smile. He had his mother's drawing gift, which manifested in a series of small, precise sketches of horses that covered every available surface of his bedroom wall. He had his father's relationship with silence, which expressed itself not as emotional distance, but as a quality of deep listening that his schoolteacher in Redemption Flats noted as unusual in a child his age. Louisa, by contrast, filled every room she occupied. She had opinions about the cattle operation that she expressed from the saddle by the time she was 5, having learned to ride with the determination of someone who had decided that competence on horseback was a fundamental right rather than an acquired skill. She asked questions of extraordinary specificity and followed them with additional questions when the answers were not fully satisfying. Jonas dealt with her questions with the same direct honesty he brought to everything, which meant that by the age of 6, Louisa Easton had a more comprehensive understanding of cattle breeding, water rights law, and the general operation of a Wyoming ranch than most adult residents of Laramie County. "She is going to be very difficult to keep up with," Jonas said one evening, watching Louisa argue a point about the North Pasture rotation with Dawson, his foreman, with a conviction that was making Dawson visibly uncertain. "She already is," Winifred said. "Dawson is losing that argument." "He is," Jonas confirmed. He sounded quietly delighted. There was a third child, a boy, in 1884. They named him Robert Jonas Easton, and he arrived with a peacefulness that stood in complete contrast to both his older siblings, a round, serene baby who slept when he was supposed to and observed the world around him with a placid curiosity that suggested either an extremely even temperament or a patience so deep that it had not yet been tested. "He is going to be the one who surprises us," Winifred told Jonas, on a quiet evening with Robert sleeping in the cradle that had held Thomas and then Louisa. "They all surprise me," Jonas said, "constantly." She looked at him, her husband of 6 years by then, sitting in the lamplight of the room she had built with her own hands, in the territory that had been Clement's dream and her reality and was now theirs together. He was reading. One of his Dickens volumes and his reading glasses, which he had acquired 2 years earlier and wore only in private, were on, and his dark hair was now more silver than not, and he was, she thought, the most beautiful familiar thing she had ever known. "Jonas," she said. He looked up. "I am glad you came through my door," she said. He looked at her in the lamplight with those steady, dark, attentive eyes that had never changed in the years she had known him, that had always looked at her with the same quality of complete and deliberate attention. "You moved over," he said. "I moved over," she confirmed. "Best decision either of us ever made," he said. She laughed and he almost smiled, and Robert slept, and the fire crackled, and outside the Wyoming night was broad and cold and full of stars. The years that followed were the accumulation of a life fully and deliberately chosen. The ranch became one of the most established operations in the county. Not the largest. Jonas had never been interested in size for its own sake, but among the most consistent and the most respected. The Maddox homestead was formally incorporated into the Easton operation in name in 1886, though Winifred always referred to the eastern section by its original designation, and Jonas had the fence line marker repainted in 1889 to include both names, Easton Maddox, Eastern Range, which she had found one morning without having been told, and which she had stood reading for a long time with a feeling too large for the limited vocabulary she permitted herself. Thomas went to study law in Denver in 1895, which surprised almost everyone and surprised neither of his parents in the slightest. He came back to Wyoming after 3 years with a degree and a young woman named Helen, and set up a practice in Redemption Flats that handled, among other things, land disputes and property rights cases, with a particular attention to the kind of injustice that had characterized his parents' early experience in the territory. Louisa stayed on the ranch. This was never in question. She had been managing sections of it since her 15th year, and by her 20s, she was handling the breeding program with a sophistication that earned the grudging respect even of men twice her age who had been in the cattle business before she was born. She married eventually, a quiet, capable man named Samuel Brecht, who had the wisdom to understand immediately that Louisa Easton did not require managing, only matching, and who matched her with a good humor and steadiness that made watching them together one of the reliable pleasures of Jonah's and Winifred's later years. Robert, the serene one, became a teacher. This made perfect sense to everyone who knew him, and he taught school in Redemption Flats for 35 years, with a patience and attentiveness that sent generations of frontier children into the world better, equipped than they had arrived. There was, in the summer of 1891, a day that Winifred returned to often in her memory in the years that followed. She and Jonas were riding the fence line of the eastern range together, as they did several times each year, checking for winter damage and planning the summer maintenance. They were on horseback in the late morning with the Wyoming summer sky enormous above them, and the grass long and green, and the mountains visible in the northwest distance, blue and permanent. They rode together in the easy silence that had always been the natural language between them, and at the top of a low rise she pulled her horse up and looked out at the spread of land below, the Maddox homestead buildings visible in the east with their new additions and their years of careful maintenance, the Easton Ranch in the northwest with its barns and corrals, and the house they had built onto twice over the years to accommodate a growing family. It was all of it visible from this point on a clear summer day, everything they had built together, and the land was green and the sky was blue, and somewhere across the grass she could hear Robert singing to himself as he rode a separate section. Jonas pulled up beside her and looked at the same view. They sat there on their horses in the summer morning and did not say anything for a long time, because there was nothing to say that the view did not already say entirely on its own. Then Jonas said quietly, "I could not have built this alone." She looked at him. "Neither could I," she said. He reached across from Phaeton's successor, a younger black horse named simply Banner, and took her hand briefly, and then they turned their horses back to the work and rode forward, as they always had, together. The winter of 1893 brought another blizzard, not as severe as the one in November of 1877, nothing quite matched that one in Winifred's memory, but significant enough to keep everyone at the ranch house for 3 days. The 3 children were home for the holiday, Thomas with Helen, Louisa with Samuel, Robert still unmarried at 13 but present and serene. The ranch house was full of voices and movement, and the smell of food, and the argument that Louisa and Thomas always had about the fence rotation, which Samuel and Helen watched with the comfortable expressions of people who had both long since accepted that this was simply what Christmas was in the Easton household. Jonas sat in the sitting room with the south-facing window, closed now against the winter, and looked at all of it with an expression that Winifred, sitting beside him, recognized as the deepest version of his contentment. "The manageable man is satisfied," she said quietly, for only him to hear. He turned to look at her, and there was the almost smile. There was the fullness behind his eyes that had not diminished in the years since she had first learned to read it. "The manageable man," he said, "is entirely at peace." She took his hand. He covered it with his. Outside the blizzard continued, the same unreasonable wind against the same sturdy walls, and inside the fire burned, and the voices of their children filled the rooms, and Winifred Maddox Easton sat beside the silent cattleman she had let through her door in a storm and knew, with the absolute certainty of a woman who had spent her whole life building things that lasted, that she had built the best thing here. She had moved over, he had stayed, and everything that followed had been exactly that, the warm, wonderful, complicated, extraordinary life that happens when 2 stubborn, capable, solitary people finally choose, with full knowledge of the cost and the gift of it, to stop being alone. The Wyoming sky remained enormous above the eastern Maddox Range. The grass continued to grow and the cattle grazed and the creek ran along its eastern bank as it always had, clearly and permanently documented in the finest legal instruments that Alderton of Cheyenne could produce. Thomas practiced law, Louisa ran cattle, Robert taught children, Samuel matched Louisa. Helen softened Thomas's courtroom edges over Sunday dinners. And Jonas and Winifred grew old in the way that people who have built their lives together grow old, which is to say they grew more themselves, more clearly themselves, more settled in each other, until the line between where one ended and the other began was not a boundary at all, but simply the beautiful, unremarkable grammar of a shared life. And in the spring evenings, when the work was done and the children were in their own houses and the ranch was quiet, Winifred would sometimes find Jonas standing outside looking at the sky in the way he always had, reading the weather from the colors and the clouds with the self-reliance of a man who trusted his own reading above any instrument. She would come and stand beside him and look at the same sky, and he would say whatever the weather was doing, and she would nod, and they would stand together in the quiet of the western evening with the mountains blue in the distance and the grass moving and the whole enormous, permanent, magnificent world that they had claimed together spread around them in every direction. It was, as Jonas Easton had said on a January morning in 1880, looking at a newborn son with his whole face unmanaged and open, exactly enough. It was, in fact, everything.